On a quiet Christmas Eve, amidst falling snow and twinkling lights, one man's life is forever changed, reminding us that sometimes it takes a moment of stillness to discover what truly matters. The snow fell softly on the quiet countryside, blanketing the world in a gentle hush. The glow of distant streetlights illuminated the drifting flakes, creating a dreamy canvas of light and shadow. Somewhere on a winding road, the low hum of an engine cut through the silence, its sound swallowed by the snowy stillness. Inside the sleek silver Jaguar F-Type, Michael Warren tightened his grip on the steering wheel, his expression unreadable. The man who had built an empire from nothing sat alone, his thoughts far removed from the Christmas magic unfolding all around him. Michael was 42, but tonight he felt decades older. The years of late nights, high-stakes deals, and constant pressure to outperform had etched lines into his face and etched his soul. He was a man admired for his ambition, but known for his detachment, a combination that left him surrounded by success, but deeply alone. As the car moved further from the city, the landscape changed. Towering buildings gave way to rolling fields, their snow-covered expanse glistening under the moonlight. It was a journey he had taken on a whim, spurred by an overwhelming desire to escape the chaos of his life. The countryside, with its promise of solitude, had seemed like the perfect refuge. The clock on the dashboard reads 9:47 p.m. Almost Christmas, Michael murmured to himself, his voice breaking the quiet for a fleeting moment. Yet, even as he acknowledged the holiday, he felt no warmth or joy. Christmas was just another day, a day marked by glittering parties, hollow conversations, and obligations he preferred to avoid. The road stretched ahead, winding gently through the forest. Michael allowed his thoughts to drift, his mind replaying the events of the past few weeks. Missed deadlines, tense meetings, and the gnawing feeling that no amount of success could fill the void inside him. And then there was Emily. The name flickered across his thoughts like a match sparking in the dark. His daughter, now 16, had left him a voicemail that morning, a gentle plea for him to spend Christmas with her. He had ignored it. She'll understand, he told himself, though the weight of the words lingered. The snow began to fall heavier now, the flakes dancing hypnotically in the car's headlights. Michael's focus wavered as the rhythm of the falling snow lulled him into a meditative state. But fate has a way of interrupting even the stillest moments. The tires slipped. Michael's hands tightened on the wheel as the car skidded across the icy road. The peaceful silence of the night was shattered by the screech of rubber against ice, the sharp gasp of his breath, and the ominous creak of a looming tree. In those split seconds, time seemed to stretch. The world spun around him, headlights flickering wildly across the trees before landing with a jarring, final thud. And then, a deafening silence. When Michael opened his eyes, he was greeted by stillness. Snow drifted gently through the shattered windshield, landing on his bruised hands and face. The cold bit at his skin, sharp and unforgiving, yet strangely grounding. His thoughts were foggy, the events of the crash playing on a loop in his mind. He shifted slightly, wincing as pain rippled through his body. A faint metallic taste filled his mouth, and his forehead throbbed where blood trickled from a deep cut. Somewhere in the distance, faint bells rang out, their sound barely audible over the whisper of the wind. For a moment, Michael wondered if he was dreaming, and then he saw it, a figure moving slowly through the snow. The man approached cautiously, his heavy coat and scarf obscuring his face. He carried an air of calm that seemed almost unnatural in the chaos of the moment. "You're lucky," the man said softly, his voice steady. "Stay still. Help is on the way." Michael wanted to respond, to ask who this stranger was and how he had found him, but the words didn't come. Exhaustion overtook him, and the world faded to black. The next time Michael woke, it was to the sound of soft beeping. The sterile scent of antiseptic filled the air, and the faint hum of fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. He blinked, his vision adjusting to the dim light of the hospital room. Everything felt distant, like a half-remembered dream. "You're awake." Michael turned his head, wincing at the stiffness in his neck. A nurse stood by his bedside, her warm smile a stark contrast to the cold, impersonal setting. "You're in Winter Hollow Hospital," she said gently. "You were in a car accident. Someone found you and called it in. You're very lucky." Lucky. The word echoed in Michael's mind, though he wasn't sure it fit. He nodded faintly, his voice too weak to respond. The nurse adjusted the blankets around him, her movements careful and deliberate. "Get some rest," she said. "You'll need it." As she left the room, Michael stared at the ceiling, his thoughts scattered like the falling snow outside. Later that day, Michael found himself by the window, his wheelchair positioned to give him a view of the small town below. Winter Hollow was quaint, with snow-covered rooftops and twinkling lights lining the streets. It was the kind of place he might have once dismissed as boring, yet now it held a quiet charm. He watched as families walked hand in hand, their laughter visible in the frosty air. Children played in the snow, their shouts of joy rising above the gentle hum of the town. For the first time in years, Michael felt the weight of his solitude. The crash had left him shaken, but it also brought a strange clarity. In the stillness of Winter Hollow, he was no longer the powerful Michael Warren, CEO of a multi-million-dollar company. He was just a man, trying to understand how he had ended up so alone. The nurse returned later, wheeling in a tray with a simple meal: broth, bread, and tea. "It's not much," she said apologetically, "but it's warm." Michael nodded, his gratitude unspoken. As he ate, the warmth of the tea spread through him, easing the tension in his chest. Outside, the snow continued to fall, blanketing the world in its quiet beauty. Michael stared out at the landscape, his thoughts drifting like flakes beyond the window. For the first time in years, he allowed himself to be still. The next morning, Michael woke to the soft glow of sunlight streaming through the hospital window. The world outside had been painted in fresh white, with the snow glistening under the golden light. For a brief moment, everything felt peaceful. A knock on the door stirred him from his thoughts. "Mr. Warren?" Michael turned to see a petite woman standing in the doorway. She had kind eyes and wore a warm wool coat, her cheeks pink from the cold. "My name is Sophie Harper," she said with a gentle smile. "I run the Snowfall Inn just outside of town. The hospital asked if I could host you while you recover. They're short on space, and with the storm, it's hard to get back to the city right now." Michael hesitated. The thought of staying in a small-town inn seemed far removed from his usual life of penthouses and five-star hotels. But as he shifted in his wheelchair, wincing at the lingering aches in his body, he realized he didn't have much choice. "That's fine," he said curtly, though his tone lacked the sharpness it once carried. Sophie nodded, unfazed by his demeanor. "I'll get everything ready. We'll leave in a couple of hours." True to her word, Sophie returned later with a nurse and helped Michael into a waiting car. The drive to the inn was short but scenic. The narrow streets of Winter Hollow were lined with snow-covered evergreens, their branches bending slightly under the weight of the snow. Wreaths adorned the lampposts, and twinkling lights cast a warm glow over the small town. When they arrived at the Snowfall Inn, Michael couldn't help but notice its charm. The building was old, but well kept, with ivy creeping up its stone walls and a cozy porch adorned with string lights. Smoke curled from the chimney, and the faint scent of pine lingered in the air. Sophie led him inside, her movements quick and efficient. "Your room is upstairs, but I've set up a space for you on the ground floor while you're recovering. It's smaller, but it's close to the fire, and you won't have to worry about stairs." The room was simple but inviting. A single bed was tucked into the corner, and a small fireplace crackled softly across from it. A large armchair sat near the window, and a stack of neatly folded blankets rested on the side table. "This should do," Sophie said, her tone warm but businesslike. I'll leave you to settle in. Dinner's at 6, and if you need anything, just let me know." Michael gave a small nod. He wasn't used to people being so accommodated without expecting something in return. As the evening settled in, the Snowfall Inn began to feel like a sanctuary. The soft glow of the fire bathed the room in warmth, and the sound of crackling logs filled the air. Michael sat in the armchair, staring into the flames, his thoughts a tangled web of memories and questions. He thought about the crash, the stranger's voice, the chance that he might not have survived. And then he thought about Emily. Her voicemail played in his mind like a haunting melody. "Dad, can we please spend Christmas together this year? It's been so long." Michael shifted uncomfortably, the weight of regret pressing against his chest. For years he had pushed her away, telling himself that work was more important. Now, in the stillness of Winter Hollow, he wasn't so sure. The sound of footsteps pulled him from his thoughts. Sophie appeared in the doorway, carrying a tray with a steaming bowl of soup and a slice of fresh bread. "I thought you might like some dinner," she said, setting the tray down on the side table. "Thanks," Michael said quietly. He picked up the spoon, the warmth of the soup filling the room with the scent of herbs and vegetables. Sophie lingered for a moment, her gaze thoughtful. "It's a quiet night," she said softly. "The kind of night that makes you think about things." Michael glanced at her, surprised by the comment. "What makes you say that?" She smiled faintly. "Winter has a way of slowing us down. It makes us see things we might have missed before." Her words lingered long after she left the room. The following days settled into a gentle routine. Mornings were slow, with sunlight streaming through the frosted windows and the faint sound of birds chirping outside. Sophie would bring breakfast, simple but hearty meals that reminded Michael of a time long before luxury had consumed his life. Afternoons were spent by the fire, where Michael often found himself lost in thought. The quiet of the inn, interrupted only by the occasional creak of the floorboards or the soft hum of Sophie's voice, was unlike anything he had experienced. One afternoon, Sophie invited Michael to join her on a walk to the local market. Though his body still ached, he agreed, eager to stretch his legs and see more of Winter Hollow. The market was a small but lively affair, with vendors selling handmade ornaments, freshly baked goods, and warm scarves. Children ran through the stalls, their laughter echoing in the crisp air. Sophie greeted nearly everyone they passed, her smile infectious. "You know everyone here?" Michael asked, his tone curious. She laughed lightly. "In a town this small, it's hard not to. People look out for each other here. It's one of the things I love most about Winter Hollow." Michael nodded, though the concept felt foreign. In the city, people barely made eye contact, let alone stopped to chat. As they wandered through the market, Michael found himself drawn to a small stall selling handcrafted wooden toys. His gaze landed on a small, intricately carved horse, its detail remarkable. "That's beautiful," Sophie said, noticing his interest. Michael picked up the toy, running his fingers over the smooth wood. For a moment, he thought of Emily, of the Christmas mornings they used to share before work took precedence over everything else. He set the toy down quickly, the memory too sharp. That evening, as the snow fell softly outside, Michael sat by the fire, his thoughts quieter than usual. Sophie had left a pot of tea on the table, and the warm, spiced aroma filled the room. For the first time in years, he felt something he couldn't quite name. It wasn't happiness or contentment, but it was close. It was as though a door he had long kept closed was beginning to creak open, letting in slivers of light. As the fire crackled and the snow whispered against the windows, Michael closed his eyes. The stillness of Winter Hollow, the warmth of the inn, and the kindness of a stranger were beginning to melt the ice that had built around his heart. And somewhere in that quiet, a seed of change began to take root. The days at the Snowfall Inn unfolded like chapters in a quiet book. Each morning began with the soft light of dawn creeping through frosted windows, accompanied by the comforting sound of Sophie bustling in the kitchen. The simple routines and the peaceful rhythm of the town were a stark contrast to the high-stakes, relentless life Michael had left behind. It had been nearly a week since the crash, and though Michael's body was still healing, he was beginning to feel a clarity he hadn't known in years. The simplicity of life in Winter Hollow was soothing, like the gentle crackle of the fire in his room or the scent of fresh pine wafting through the air. One afternoon, Sophie appeared with a coat slung over her arm. "The snow's perfect for a walk," she said with a warm smile. "Care to join me?" Michael hesitated for a moment, but something about her invitation felt impossible to refuse. He nodded, pulling on his boots and wrapping the scarf she had lent him around his neck. The air outside was crisp and refreshing, carrying the faint scent of wood smoke from nearby chimneys. The snow crunched softly under their boots as they walked along a quiet trail that wound through the woods behind the inn. The trees were bare, their branches etched against the pale winter sky like delicate lace. The world felt hushed, as though even nature itself was pausing to listen. "This place is different," Michael said, his voice quieter than usual. Sophie glanced at him, her eyes bright. "Different in a good way, I hope?" He nodded slowly. "It's quieter, calmer. I didn't think I'd like that." She smiled. "It grows on you, doesn't it? I think sometimes the noise of the world makes it hard to hear what really matters." Her words lingered in the cold air, sinking into Michael's thoughts. Later that day, Sophie invited Michael to join her in decorating the inn for an upcoming community gathering. She brought out boxes of ornaments, garlands, and fairy lights, each item wrapped with care. "This was my grandmother's favorite part of the year," Sophie said, as she carefully unwrapped a delicate glass ornament shaped like a snowflake. "She always said Christmas was about bringing people together, even in the simplest ways." Michael nodded, watching as she draped garlands along the mantel. The smell of fresh greenery filled the room, mingling with the faint scent of cinnamon from the cookies Sophie had baked earlier. "Do you host events like this often?" he asked, more out of curiosity than anything else. Sophie smiled. "Whenever I can. The inn isn't just a place to stay, it's a place to connect. People need that, especially during the holidays." Michael's gaze lingered on her as she spoke. There was a sincerity in her voice that he wasn't used to. For years, his world had been filled with calculated conversations and ulterior motives. Sophie's kindness felt like a breath of fresh air. That evening, as the decorations were nearly complete, Michael found himself standing by the fireplace, staring at the twinkling lights on the tree. Sophie joined him, a mug of hot cocoa in each hand. "Here," she said, handing him one. "It's not Christmas without hot cocoa." Michael accepted the mug, the warmth of the drink spreading through his fingers. For a moment, they stood in comfortable silence, watching the firelight dance across the room. "Why do you do it?" he asked suddenly, his voice low. Sophie turned to him, her expression curious. "Do what?" "All of this," he said, gesturing around the room. "The decorations, the gatherings, the kindness. What's in it for you?" Sophie's smile softened. "Not everything has to be about getting something in return, Michael. Sometimes the act itself is enough. Seeing people smile, knowing they feel cared for, that's what matters." Her words struck a chord he wasn't ready to acknowledge. He looked down at the mug in his hands, the steam curling into the air. "I'm not sure I understand that," he admitted quietly. "You will," Sophie said gently. "It just takes time." The next day, Michael accompanied Sophie to the community centre, where the townspeople were preparing for a holiday event. The space was bustling with activity, children laughing as they made paper snowflakes, volunteers arranging tables, and the scent of freshly baked pies filling the air. Sophie introduced Michael to a few of the volunteers, each one greeting him with warmth and curiosity. It was clear they respected Sophie deeply, and their kindness extended naturally to anyone she brought into their circle. As the day went on, Michael found himself drawn into the work. He helped string lights along the walls, carried boxes of supplies, and even assisted a group of children with hanging ornaments on a small tree. For the first time in years, he felt a sense of purpose that wasn't tied to deadlines or profit margins. The simple act of contributing, of being part of something, filled a void he hadn't realized was there. Sophie watched him from across the room, her eyes soft with approval. That evening, as the snow began to fall again, Michael and Sophie walked back to the inn. The streets were quiet, the only sound, the faint crunch of their boots on the snow. "I think I'm starting to see what you meant," Michael said, breaking the silence. Sophie glanced at him, her expression curious. "About doing things for others," he continued. "It's different, but it feels good." She smiled, her breath visible in the cold air. "I'm glad. The world could use more people who care." Michael nodded, his thoughts drifting. For years, he had built his life around the idea of success, of achieving, accumulating, and controlling. But here, in the quiet of Winter Hollow, he was beginning to see the cracks in that foundation. As they reached the inn, Sophie paused on the porch, her gaze lifting to the stars above. "It's funny, isn't it?" she said softly. "Sometimes it takes a moment of stillness to see what's been in front of us all along." Michael followed her gaze, the stars twinkling against the inky black sky. He didn't respond, but for the first time in years, he felt a flicker of something he hadn't allowed himself to feel in a long time. Hope. The Snowfall Inn glowed warmly against the snowy landscape, its windows flickering with the light of the roaring fire inside. Michael stood by the window of his room, gazing out at the small town below. He watched as the streets began to quiet for the evening, families retreating into their cozy homes, their laughter fading into the winter air. For the first time in years, Michael felt something stir within him, a sense of longing. It wasn't for the fast-paced life he'd left behind, but for something deeper, something he hadn't known he was missing. The thought stayed with him as he made his way downstairs, where Sophie was placing candles on the tables in preparation for the upcoming community gathering. The scent of pine and cinnamon filled the air, mingling with the faint hum of holiday music from a small radio in the corner. "You've been quiet today," Sophie said, glancing up from her work. Michael hesitated, unsure how to articulate what he was feeling. "Just thinking," he said finally. She smiled knowingly. That's what Winter Hollow does to people. It gives them time to think. He watched her as she moved around the room, her presence calm and steady. There was a grace to the way she carried herself, a quiet strength that reminded him of everything he had once dismissed as unimportant. "Do you ever think about leaving?" he asked suddenly. Sophie paused, considering the question. "Not really," she said softly. "This place is home. It's where I feel like I can make a difference." Michael nodded, her words sinking in. The idea of finding contentment in simplicity was still foreign to him, but he couldn't deny that there was something about Winter Hollow and Sophie that was beginning to feel like an anchor. That evening, the community gathering at the inn was in full swing. Guests filled the lounge, their voices blending into a warm, harmonious buzz. The tables were adorned with candles and festive centerpieces, and the air was alive with the smell of spiced cider and freshly baked pastries. Michael lingered near the fireplace, observing the scene with quiet fascination. Families gathered around the tables, children laughed as they played near the tree, and neighbors exchanged stories as though they were part of one big family. Sophie moved effortlessly through the crowd, her warmth and kindness drawing people in like a magnet. Michael found himself drawn to her too, watching the way she brought people together with a simple smile or a thoughtful word. At one point, Sophie approached him with a mug of cider. "Enjoying yourself?" she asked, her eyes twinkling. Michael took the mug, his fingers brushing hers for a moment. "It's different," he admitted, "but in a good way." She smiled. Different can be good. They stood in comfortable silence for a while, watching as the guests mingled. Michael felt a strange sense of belonging. something he hadn't felt in years. "This is what I love about this place," Sophie said softly. "People coming together, supporting each other. It's what the holidays are all about." Michael nodded, her words resonating deeply. He thought about all the Christmases he had spent surrounded by wealth and extravagance, yet none of them had felt as genuine as this simple gathering in a small-town inn. As the night wore on and the guests began to leave, Michael stayed behind to help Sophie clean up. They worked side by side, clearing tables and gathering stray decorations. "You didn't have to stay," Sophie said, glancing at him with a small smile. "I wanted to," Michael replied simply. The room grew quieter as they finished their tasks, the soft glow of the fire casting long shadows on the walls. Michael felt a pull to say something, to break through the walls he had built around himself. "Sophie," he began, his voice hesitant. She turned to him, her expression curious. "I've been thinking a lot since the crash," he said slowly. "About my life, the choices I've made, the things I've missed." Sophie waited patiently, sensing the weight of his words. "I've spent so many years chasing things that don't matter," Michael continued. "Money, power, success, but none of it has ever made me feel the way this place does." Her gaze softened, but she didn't interrupt. "I don't know what I'm doing here," he admitted. "But for the first time, I feel like I don't need to have all the answers." Sophie smiled gently. "Sometimes, not knowing is the first step to figuring it out." Her words hung in the air, their simplicity profound. The next morning, Michael woke to the sound of soft knocking on his door. He opened it to find Sophie standing there, holding a small package wrapped in simple brown paper. "This is for you," she said, handing it to him. Michael frowned, puzzled. "What is it?" "Open it and see," Sophie replied with a teasing smile. He unwrapped the package carefully, revealing a small wooden horse, the same one he had admired at the market. "I noticed you looking at it," Sophie said softly. "I thought it might remind you of something important." Michael stared at the horse, his throat tightening. He thought of Emily, of the moments he had missed, and of the chance he now had to make things right. "Thank you," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Sophie smiled, her eyes warm. Sometimes, it's the little things that mean the most. That day, Michael sat by the fire, the wooden horse resting on the table beside him. He picked up his phone, staring at Emily's number on the screen. His thumb hovered over the call button, the weight of years of distance pressing down on him. Finally, he pressed it. The phone rang once, twice, and then her voice came through the line. "Dad?" Michael's heart ached at the sound. "Emily," he said softly. "It's me." There was a pause, and then she spoke again, her tone cautious but hopeful. "I didn't think you'd call." "I'm sorry," Michael said, the words tumbling out in a rush. "I've been so caught up in everything that I forgot what really matters. I want to fix this, Emily. I want to be there for you." Her response was quiet, but it held a warmth that melted the icy walls around his heart. "I'd like that, Dad." As the call ended, Michael felt a sense of relief he hadn't known he needed. He looked at the wooden horse, a small smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. Sophie was right. Sometimes, it's the little things that mean the most. The days after Michael's phone call with Emily seemed lighter, as though a weight he'd carried for years had finally been lifted. He found himself smiling more, even in quiet moments, as the warmth of their reconnection began to settle in his heart. Sophie noticed the change too. "Something's different about you," she said one morning as they prepared breakfast together. Michael glanced at her, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "I called my daughter," he admitted. Sophie's eyes lit up, her hands pausing over the tray of pastries she was arranging. "That's wonderful. How did it go?" "She forgave me," Michael said softly. the words still feeling new and fragile. I didn't deserve it, but she forgave me anyway. Sophie smiled, her expression full of quiet pride. Sometimes forgiveness isn't about what we deserve. It's about opening the door to something better. Michael nodded, her words resonating deeply. For years he had closed himself off, convinced that the walls he'd built were for his protection. But here, in Winter Hollow, those walls had begun to crumble, revealing something he had long forgotten: the power of connection. That afternoon, Sophie invited Michael to join her on an errand to deliver care packages to some of the town's elderly residents. The boxes were filled with homemade treats, warm blankets, and handwritten notes from the local children. As they made their way through the snowy streets, Sophie explained the tradition. "It started with my grandparents," she said. "They believed Christmas was about taking care of one another, especially those who might feel forgotten." Michael carried one of the boxes, its weight oddly grounding. "It's a good tradition," he said, glancing at Sophie. She smiled. "It is. And it reminds me why I love this place. Everyone looks out for each other." At each stop, Michael watched as Sophie greeted the residents with genuine warmth, her presence lighting up their small, cozy homes. He found himself stepping in to help, carrying packages, and even joining in on brief conversations. At their final stop, an elderly woman named Mrs. Lowell clasped Michael's hand as he handed her a box. "Thank you, young man," she said, her voice soft but steady. "It's nice to know people still care." Michael felt a lump form in his throat. He hadn't done much, but her gratitude was palpable, like a ripple spreading through him. As they walked back to the inn, the sky began to darken, the first stars twinkling faintly above. Sophie looked at him, her expression thoughtful. "You're good at this," she said. "At what?" Michael asked, genuinely curious. "At caring," Sophie replied simply. Michael didn't respond right away, but her words stayed with him long after they returned to the inn. That evening, Michael found himself by the fire once more, the wooden horse resting in his hands. Sophie joined him, carrying 2 mugs of tea. "You've come a long way," she said, handing him a mug. Michael chuckled softly. "It's funny, isn't it? A car crash, a small town, and a stranger who wouldn't let me wallow in my own misery. That's all it took to turn my life upside down." Sophie smiled. "Sometimes life has to break us open to let the light in." Her words struck a chord, and Michael looked at her, his gaze steady. "You've done more than let the light in," he said quietly. "You've shown me what life could be, what it should be." Sophie's smile softened, and for a moment, the only sound was the gentle crackle of the fire. "I didn't do anything special," she said. "You had it in you all along. You just needed someone to remind you." Michael set the wooden horse down and reached for her hand. "You've reminded me of a lot of things, Sophie, and you've made me want to be better. Not just for Emily, but for myself. And maybe for you too." Sophie's cheeks flushed, her gaze holding his. "Michael, I'm not the same man I was when I walked through your door," he said, his voice steady. "And I don't want to leave here without telling you how much you mean to me." Sophie's lips curved into a gentle smile. "You mean a lot to me too, Michael. More than I expected." Michael's hand tightened around hers, and for the first time in years, he felt a sense of peace he couldn't explain. The next morning, the inn buzzed with preparations for the New Year's Eve gathering. Sophie worked tirelessly, her energy contagious as she directed volunteers and added finishing touches to the decorations. Michael pitched in, helping set up tables and string lights. The work felt purposeful, each task a small step toward creating something beautiful. By the time the guests began to arrive, the inn was transformed into a glowing haven of warmth and joy. The smell of freshly baked bread and spiced cider filled the air, and laughter echoed through the halls. As midnight approached, Sophie gathered everyone near the large Christmas tree in the lounge. The lights twinkled softly, casting a magical glow over the room. Michael stood beside her, his heart full as he watched the townspeople exchange hugs and well wishes. When the clock struck midnight, the room erupted into cheers. Michael turned to Sophie, his gaze steady. "Happy New Year," he said softly. "Happy New Year," she replied, her smile radiant. Without hesitation, Michael leaned closer, pressing a gentle kiss to her cheek. It wasn't a grand gesture, but it carried a depth of emotion that words couldn't capture. Sophie's eyes shimmered as she looked at him. "This is just the beginning, isn't it?" Michael nodded. "It is, and I'm ready for it." In the weeks that followed, Michael stayed in Winter Hollow, helping Sophie with the inn and becoming a part of the community. Emily visited often, their relationship growing stronger with each conversation and shared moment. For the first time, Michael wasn't chasing success or running from his past. He was simply living, present, grounded, and grateful. One crisp spring morning, as Michael and Sophie stood on the porch of the inn, he turned to her with a soft smile. "You've given me a gift I didn't know I needed," he said. Sophie took his hand, her touch warm and reassuring. "And you've reminded me that second chances aren't just possible, they're worth taking." As the sun rose higher, casting golden light over the snow-dusted town, Michael felt an overwhelming sense of peace. Winter Hollow had changed him, but it was Sophie who had shown him the way. And in her, he had found not just love, but the life he had always been searching for. Michael's journey reminds us all that even in the darkest moments, there's light to be found, and sometimes it's closer than we think. If this story touched your heart, please like, share, and subscribe to our channel for more soothing tales to guide you into rest.